Hi guys, in this video I want to talk about the evolution of game development in terms of technicality, how we've gone from everything being written in the lowest level code all the way up to the point where now AI is presumably writing all the code for us. So I have some handy notes here to refer to, so if you see me looking at stuff, that would be what it is. So my background with programming goes back a long way. I'm pretty old, and my very first experience with programming and computers was all the way back on a Commodore 64, and I used to spend hours and hours typing in listings, like actual program listings from magazines and books, to try and get a working piece of software, usually a game. And this was how I got started with programming. And back then, programming meant code, development meant code. And, when you read about, say, these programmers that are making these games, that's what they were. They were programmers. I mean, obviously, they would be artists as well because they're creating art for their games. But generally speaking, back then, game development for a large part of it meant code. But over the last few decades, things have really, really started to change. So, over the years, as I started to do some development work myself, I found myself working with a lot of APIs and frameworks. So, in terms of games, my very first foray into it was using something called SDL, which was like the simple direct media layer, and this was kind of like the predecessor to DirectX. And then later on, when I first started doing game development this time around, I started to work with a framework called Monogame, and that itself was built on another API whose name I forget, which is what what's his name, Eric Baroni, used to make Stardew Valley. And I've used other APIs in other types of software development. So I spent a lot of time in web development. I used something called the Zend engine, and then later on I went on to use something called Laravel. So this is another common thing, is that APIs and packages and frameworks, they do a lot of the low level stuff for you, and then you have to basically learn that API. You have to learn sort of like the functions and all of that stuff. And it's the same with modern visual engines. So these days, of course, most game developers are going to be using an engine, a visual engine, and this is what I moved to after I had spent a little while working with Monogame. I built a couple of games with that. I decided it was too low level for me, and I wanted to use something that had a lot more functionality out the box. So I moved to Unity, and as I was making that decision, I looked at some other visual engines like Unreal, Godot in particular, and a few others as well. There's loads of different engines out there. And if you think about what an engine is doing, again, it's kind of like it's building up its own framework. So you have to learn the engine, you have to learn what classes it has, what functions it has, and so forth. But then a visual engine has got a lot more than just the API. It's also got all of those visual tools. So over the last few months, as I've been learning Unity and building up various kind of games, I've started to experiment with all the various, or not all the various tools, but a few of the tools that come bundled with Unity. So, for example, I've looked at things like the animator tool, the line renderer, particle system, and the most recent one I started to look at was the spline tool, and this was to make like a curved hand of cards. And all of these tools are something you have to learn to use, but they've got nothing to do with code. There's no code that, well, there is code sort of like under the hood, and you'll sometimes in code you might want to like run an animation or edit the point of a spline or something like that. But generally speaking, they're visual tools. And then going on from there, we've now got things like visual scripting. We've got stuff like Bolt for Unity, and this is similar to Unreal's Blueprint system. These are the kinds of things that allow game developers now to be able to make complete full-featured games without ever having to touch a line of code. And then, of course, going a step further than that, the last few years we've seen AI. I mean, personally speaking, when I have tried to use AI to help me with coding, I find that it's just more of a hindrance than a help. So, for example, if I'm struggling with something, it's usually something to do with math, to be honest, because that's not my forte. If I'm just saying to me, how am I going to calculate the angle of a rotation of some object or something, it might be able to help me with that. But other than that, I find it's not particularly helpful. But it will be. It won't be long before we can have AI churning out complete games, and I dread to think what's going to happen to like the Steam ecosystem or something when AI starts churning out hundreds of games a day or thousands or whatever. But for me, as an older person who's been working in software through the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and now we're in 2025, it's really interesting to kind of like think back, over not just my own history, but software development in general. And it's also a little bit frightening because when I started on this game dev journey, I just assumed that having a strong programming background was really going to help me. It has, to an extent. It certainly has. I mean, when it comes to doing the programming for my games, obviously I find that stuff fairly easy. But what I'm finding is that I had no idea how much work I was going to have to put into everything else that wasn't programming. So for like my latest game, it was like a little card game, and I had to spend probably at least 50% of the time working on artwork, working on the data, kind of like the content for the game. Haven't even touched the audio yet. Didn't even get time to get that far. So it's for a game jam, so I only had a couple of weeks to make it. But I'm finding this in more and more of my games. I have to put the time in, like, for example, there's another game I want to build where I know I'm going to have to do some kind of like world building. There's the level design. And for me personally, I'm kind of leaning towards more systems based games. So for example, I'm more interested in making a game that's kind of a strategy game where I'll be coding the systems behind it. I'd be much more likely to make something like that than a game that's going to need, say, 100 handcrafted levels, for example. That's not something that I would take on. But even as someone who's leaning towards more of those systems based stuff, I still have to spend time thinking about artwork, thinking about data, thinking about those tools, thinking about how I'm going to build the world and how I'm going to link all this stuff together. And the coding is a much smaller part of it than I thought it was going to be. And that's been quite a shock for me. And I wonder how this is going to play out going forwards. I mean, certainly as I'm starting to work on more and more games, I'm finding myself being able to kind of like go back to a previous game and just lift out something that I've used before. So for example, for the audio that I mentioned, I have been working on like an audio manager, which has been getting better and better with each game, and I can pretty much drag and drop that into the next game with very little modification. So the systems, they're going to kind of evolve and go with me. So I'm going to be spending more time with each game on all that other stuff, the artwork, the world building, and so forth. And so for me, this is a little bit scary because ultimately, I'm not an artist and I'm not really an ideas person. I'm not one of these people that has ideas for like huge creative worlds, and they want to, there's people out there that want to build a world, that want to tell a story through their game. I'm basically a programmer and I want to build games with code. That's really where I'm coming from. But I'd be interested to know, where you stand on this and how you feel about it. I've looked at my YouTube audience, and obviously I think because I'm an older person, I have a slightly older audience, but even my audience is still a lot younger than I am. There's a big chunk of people that are something like 25 to 35. So, where do you stand on this? What's your background? Do you enjoy the programming side of things? Are you pleased about this shift, going away from the technical and having things like AI do more and more and more of the work, and having the engines do more and more of the heavy lifting for you? Are you pleased that you're able to focus on, the design and the art and the storytelling and the audio and all of that other stuff Is that what you want to work on? Or do you wish you could just like dig into the code and like just be a bit of a code hacker? As I think that ultimately that's kind of like what I want to do. But on the other hand, I'm kind of like in a bit of a middle ground, because the reason I moved from Monogame to Unity was because that I realized if I was going to continue using Monogame, I'd basically have to kind of make my own little engine for it, and that's something I didn't want to do, which is why I moved to Unity. So yeah, I'm kind of like caught between a rock and a hard place there. It's like on the one hand, I want to do lots of code, but on the other hand, I don't want to go too low level with it. But I think I know what I mean by that. I want to work on the systems for my games, but I don't want to have to spend time doing loads of artwork and stuff. And that leads me on to another video that I'm going to do separately about being a solo developer who's more technically minded. But I'll leave that one for another day. So yeah, tell me how you feel about this topic. Where do you think game development is going to go over the next few years? How do you think it's going to look like in 5 years, 10 years time? I have no clue. Honestly, I think it's a little bit scary to think about. But yeah, I'll be interested to see, hear what you think about this and what your thoughts are, how you feel about your own games, your own sort of like history with it. Tell me where you are with it. All right, that's all I've got for this video. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Speak to you next time.